Hello, everybody. Welcome and good morning. Welcome to this, which is the fourth of 5 webinars organised by Cancer Patients Europe within the framework of the European Week Against Cancer. I'm Tamsin Rose and I'm the moderator for this series of webinars. Over the last few days, we have covered inequalities in prevention, access to accurate and innovative diagnostics, and innovation in treatment. Today, we've got a really interesting topic. We are going to be talking about life after cancer. What happens after treatment? The challenges of reintegrating into daily life as a cancer survivor. If you are watching this and you are using social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag EWAC 2024. That's for European Week Against Cancer 2024. And that allows us to follow how you contribute to the conversation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be able to catch up with it and all of the others in this series on the YouTube channel of Cancer Patients Europe. So just to get us started, every day we've had a short trivia quiz at the beginning just to try things out. So now I've got a question I'm going to ask you and I'd like to see your views, please. In previous days, we asked where was the earliest description of cancer, what was the earliest description of treatment, and then where did the word cancer came from. And today, the challenge we're asking you is, which one of these animals demonstrates natural cancer resistance? There are some animals, and we'd like to see what it is you think has natural resistance. So your options are the naked mole rat, the Dolof cave spider, the owl parrot, or the Sumatran orangutan. And of course, I'm sure you all know that we share something like 97% of our DNA with orangutans. They are incredibly close to us. We've seen orangutans trying to heal themselves and also use tools, so they're very close to us. But which animal demonstrates natural resistance? And we've seen some answers coming in. And so far, the little picture you see in front of you, we've put a picture because not everyone would know what it looks like. That is a naked mole rat. And it's clearly naked. It has no fur. But so far, 75% of you think that's the creature that has a natural resistance to cancer. A quarter of you think actually it might be a spider. Maybe their bodies and their biologies are so different that cancer is not something that could affect insects. 8% of you think it might be the orangutans. Nobody's voting for the owl parrot so far. But that's, I'm now going to close our poll, and the wisdom of the crowd has won again today, because it is indeed the naked mole rat, which, as you can see, this little creature there, it's small, but it's for some reason, and this is why scientists want to study it, it shows natural resistance to cancer. So thank you for that. And now we will go back to our content for the day. And I'd like to introduce the first speaker, and that is Dr. Françoise Meunier. She is the founder of the European Initiative on Ending Discrimination Against Cancer Survivors. And she's going to give us some insight about the right to be forgotten. So, Dr. Meunier, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to thank Cancer Patient Europe for letting me speak to this fantastic week on cancer priority on inequalities. This is a topic really very close to my heart and close to my current activities. As you know, I have been working in oncology this year for 50 years. And when I was graduated as a medical doctor, announcing a diagnosis of cancer in 1974 was a death sentence. And we are extremely lucky to have gone through these 5 decades, showing tremendous progress in our knowledge and in our understanding and treatment of patients with cancer. That led me in 2014, so 10 years ago, to create the first Survivorship Summit in Europe, because I was puzzled and concern with feedbacks that we got from patients that we are curing more and more, such as children with leukemia, patients with testis cancer, breast cancer, all of this because of prevention and better treatment, who came back to us and say we are penalized, discriminated, because we had cancer and we got through this ordeal. But when we tell them go to back to normal life, they are facing new issue, challenge that we were not expected to see, particularly in the financial service access. For example, if you are young, having gone through leukemia and then going to university, willing to buy an apartment or a home, the bank have difficulty to give you mortgage and forget about your past disease because you require most of the time an insurance, a life insurance, and this insurance company take into account your past medical histories. And that's why the right to be forgotten, and it's totally different of the right to be forgotten for GDPR. This is nothing to do. It's not to be erased from database. It is the right to forget your disease after a certain delay when we, medical doctors, tell go back to normal life, you are cured, we do no longer need so many tests and so on. And so since 2014, I decided to dedicate the last part of my professional activities. Obviously, I told you that it was 50 years that I am an MD, so you can guess my age. And I am officially retired, but I work only on this financial access for cancer survivors. And this is important to call them cancer survivor and not cancer patient, because we are considering that we are able to cure many patients, which the society don't realize and don't adapt its process, particularly for access to financial service. So I work on both aspects, member state by member state, and I'm very happy to realize that now there are 8 member states who have the law on the right to be forgotten, but also we can work on an European level because, well, I have always been working on an European level, and I think it's unfair for cancer survivors for other member states not to benefit from this right to be forgotten. So it's a battle that we have to still do to take into consideration specific issue for patients who are surviving cancer for long term.
Thank you very much. And you very clearly, it's an issue that you are passionate about, and it's energizing for you. And 8 member states, congratulations. That's you're getting there. That's about a third of the EU member countries. So bit by bit, you're making progress. I'm really happy now to introduce 2 other speakers who are members of my panel. And just to let you know, the audience, I have a couple of questions for each of my panel, but then I'm going to open the floor to you and your questions, and you can submit your questions using the Q&A function. You'll find that on the bottom or side of your screen, depending on how you're watching this. So please feel free to submit your questions, and when we get to that part, we'll get through as many questions as we can. So keep your ideas and your thoughts coming in. Let me introduce the 2 other members of the panel. I have Anya Buhach. She is a psycho-oncologist, a patient advocate, the founder of Fundacja Pani Ani, and also a member of the Youth Cancer Europe Network. Welcome, Anya. And I have Dr. Philippe G. Bousquet, the Director of Observation, Data Science and Assessment at the French National Cancer Institute. And they'll help us, together with Dr. Meunier, to explore a little bit more about this issue. But before we do that, I have a poll question for you in the audience. And Dr. Meunier explained there's this moment with the good news that doctors are increasingly being able to say to cancer patients, you're no longer a cancer patient, you're cured, go out and live your life. So what do cancer survivors need post-treatment? And we're going to give you 5 options of potential things that cancer survivors might need, and we'd like you to identify 2 of them. So we've got a poll going on now that we'd like you to answer, please. We've suggested that some of the things that they might be looking for would include access to mental health support, financial assistance, survivorship care plans, support groups and peer networks, which are so very active when they're patients in active treatment, but post that, what do survivors need? And then finally, adapted employment options, so that if they need follow-up care or they need checkups or other things, that can be adapted to their needs and their capacities. So we'd like you can choose 2 out of these 5 options. So we'd like you to choose 2 things that you think would be important for cancer survivors. So we're waiting now to see some messages, and already I'm seeing that there's strong support for survivorship care plans and adapted employment options. Those are the messages that are coming through, and we'll touch on that in our panel discussion. But this is the question: what does survivorship mean? We're talking about life after acute treatment, when you are transitioning back into everyday life. We said it's life after cancer. What are the things that you would need? And we can see that survivorship care plans are the strong thing that's come forward, together with adapted employment options. And then in 3rd place, we've got access to mental health support. So thank you very much for submitting your ideas. And it's survivorship care plan, I know we're going to touch on that, and adapted employment options have been chosen as the number 1 and 2. So let's close that poll now. Thank you. And a reminder that as you're listening to our panelists speak, if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll get to them in a little bit. So Dr. Meunier, you touched on this already in your first introduction, but can you help us to understand more? What does the right to be forgotten mean for cancer survivors? Why is it so important for them?
Well, it is important because they need to go back to reintegrate the so-called normal life. And the right to be forgotten allow them indeed to get back to some type of normalcy and to the society. So I think it's a question of timing, and we cannot access to financial service immediately when you have finished the treatment. You can accept that there is some delay of observation to make sure that you don't have a recurrence, but we are basing our approach to what is existing. And I think I plead for not reinventing the wheel. In fact, I was very much inspired in 2016 by the French law. Actually, I am not French, as you know, but the French took the law in 2016, and that was a very strong argument to say that it is functioning in France, it should be accessible and functioning in all the member states. And again, I state that we should not reinvent the wheel and take what is currently feasible and acceptable. And that's why I am pleading for 5 years delay and to go back to normal life after 5 years without recurrence.
Thank you very much. And I really liked your first intervention, where you explained that there is a difference between the right to be forgotten under the GDPR, which is around data protection, and what you're talking about is different. It's the right to forget your disease, to not let it define the rest of your life. And I think that's absolutely key. And you've highlighted also that for many cancers, when the doctor says, after 5 years, you're now free of it, that is a very different time period, because modern medicine has moved quickly, but insurance companies and others tend to say, well, no, it should be 15 years. And there's a big difference. If you want to build your life, if you want to get life insurance, travel insurance, you want to take out a mortgage, that difference of 10 years between 5 years when the doctors say you're free of it, and an insurance company who says it's only at this point we would give you the appropriate tariff, those 10 years are critical for people building their lives. So thank you. Anya, let me bring you in now. So tell us a little bit more about the kinds of experiences that cancer patients have. What are the barriers that they have, that when they pass through that acute and they become survivors and they're looking to plan the rest of their life and try to reintegrate back into everyday life, what are they facing?
Thank you, Tamsin, for asking the question, and also thank you very much for this opportunity to Cancer Patient Europe to speak today. Now, as what Dr. Meunier has touched on, there's a difference between the self-identification between a cancer survivor and a cancer patient, a person with lived experience, and I think that's what I would like to begin with. A person with lived experience would like to continue the life as it was, but then you quickly realize that nothing's going to be ever be the same like it used to be. And this starts with the basics and a simple access to long-term follow-up care. Now, the infrastructure is really not existing. So far, only 3 countries have a really proper long-term follow-up infrastructure set up, and that's Italy, Belgium, and Netherlands, and that's something we need to understand. So a proper long-term follow-up and infrastructure to that, and access to financial and insurance services is basic. Also, the right to be forgotten in the context of adoption rights, of fertility preservation and fertility access. These are like basic human rights, right? And I think this is something that a person with lived experience need to be at least aware and accessible. And that involves really an interdisciplinary teamwork here. And this is what we are presenting during this week of this amazing series, because addressing, beginning from research to actually practical infrastructural settings is for us survivors relevant. Now, talking only about, on a professional level, but down, I am in my everyday work, I work with AYA cancer survivors, right? And I see what young people are really struggling with, and this is back to school. This is reintegrate myself to work. How do I talk with my partner about my lived experience? How do I retain my quality of life? And I mean, in its basic, right? So a research and access is a minimum standard. And this is something what I would like to say. Yesterday, something very important was said. We are looking at people, not tumors. And that has been, that has touched me very much. I am myself a long-term cancer survivors. I've been diagnosed in the early 90s, where access to care, long-term follow-up was a dream. And I'm talking also about a basic access to fertility preservation, basic access to get a mortgage, which I could never get, right? Or basic insurance. And this is just not only me, this is for us, people with lived experience, a crucial thing that we need to address. And thank you for this opportunity, first and foremost. So the minimum standards of care in, across Europe for AYA survivors is something I would like to manifest, but also the right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten, as Dr. Meunier mentioned, not in the context of GPR, but in the right context of access, of just basic, and the broader understanding of what we need as cancer survivors is only possible when we talk to each other, when we try to improve and understand our needs, right? So yes, that's...
Thank you. So again, wonderful to hear you explain all the different aspects of people's lives and how these absolutely basic fundamental human rights, the ability to get a job, to buy a home, to create a family, to get travel insurance, to live and go about your lives is really what cancer survivors and people with lived experience are looking for. And I know one of the areas we've spoken before that's a sort of key moment of fragility is the transition. For pediatric patients, it's that transition moment from pediatric care to adult care. For other people, it's the transition from acute treatment back into the general population and the need for follow-up care. So it's these transition moments that need particular attention. Would you like to say something about that?
And the particular, it's a very crucial time, and it's something about safety. When you are transitioning from pediatric care, pediatric oncology is well taken care of. Of course, there's always room for improvement. And then all of a sudden, a young person from a very cared setting
From a cocoon, a protected cocoon.
Like more or less, right? It's transitioning into a adult care where there's often a misunderstanding of the needs of a young cancer patient, of a survivor, and then transitioning into adult care where there is no set and regulated infrastructure yet. So we are working on many European projects. Among this is EU CAIAS-net, where we have been trying to set minimal standards of AYA care and also the right language, which is so important, to use the right language and this is addressing healthcare professionals. This is access to mental health facilitation, because this trauma is shaping your life. Now, we would like to have a society that goes back to work, that is contributing to the society as well. But we need to invest also, we're investing such a huge amount of money into treatment. What about investing into how to say
follow-up care,
but also a little bit of care on your mental health, of redirecting, of navigating is maybe the rightest word, into a right navigation into an adult life. But for this, we need also the right infrastructure.
Thank you. And just in case our audience hasn't heard that terminology, you talked about AYA. Can you explain what AYA means?
Certainly, that is adolescent and young adults, and that has been
Thank you.
A group that has been often kind of left out, right? Because
yes,
you're not pediatrics, you're not an adult, and this is something that is our future, young people, right? And then this is not just a slogan. We really need to help young people to get them into reintegration into society, functional society.
Thank you. So now we all understand what when we hear the terminology AYA, that's what it means. It's adolescents and young adults. Thank you. Let me now bring in Dr. Philippe Bousquet, because you are the sort of sitting on the pile of data. And we know that policy needs to be based on good evidence and data. And we're talking about an entirely new category of the population, people who are not cancer patients going through active treatment, but we still need to be able to identify them in order to provide follow-up care and support and long-term care. So how do you sort of find a way of making the cancer survivors visible in the data collection that you do, so that we can get proper policy made?
Yes, hello everybody. Well, first of all, we all focus on a very, very important point. We should not look at the person with a disease or a cancer survivor, but we should look at the person. And that's very important, but in fact, you have a person. And that's the main point. And also we know that, or you suggest in your question, that it is mandatory for policymakers to have a good understanding of the disease and to have the medical history. They have access to robust data and knowledge. But we also know that they do not need to have a knowledge on everything or on exhaustive data. You need to have accurate data, and that's very important. And I can give you several examples just to let you understand that. We often focus on childhood cancer. Fortunately, these cancers are not very common, and this is very important. In France, they account for 2,000 new case diagnosed each year out of 435,000. That means that is only less 0.5% of the cancer in France. Meaning in that that's not a question of number. This is solely a social question in that case. And just to say, okay, childhood, not a point, no, that's not a question. Another point is to focus on the correct population. When you look at the figure, quite often you look for incidence, which is a number of new cases per year. You can go on mortality, you can go on prevalence. Prevalence is the number of persons with the cancer at one time. And you focus on the whole population. But if we will look at the right to be forgotten, we should focus on 20, 65 years old, and that's all. Because if you want to know your life expectancy, and you are an 80 years old person when you contract your cancer, you cannot live 20 years. I'm sorry to say that, or otherwise you would have 100 years. It will be perfect if you can, and I will be very happy for you, but I'm not certain that I could go there. So you know, you always need to focus on the correct data. And the point is when you look at the disease, and quite often we are asked to have data on stage at diagnosis, depending if you go through a screening or not, and the subtype of cancer and so on. But in fact, you have another indicator quite good, which is the conditional survival, meaning that you only focus on people still alive after a certain number of years, after a few years, meaning, for instance, after 5 years. That means that you have a subgroup of population, the person with a good prognostic, and without any treatment, you know. And then when you want to focus on the right to be forgotten, we should focus on this person, because this is one who can apply for a loan or for a mortgage in their future, you know. And this example can tell you that you don't need to have data on everything, but you need to have the correct data at the correct place. And just finally, to give a final point of that, in Europe, we have a European Inequalities registry. And you can see that there are some differences between countries. And when you want to have data, they want to have data on every country. But if you go through conditional survival, you manage that before. Because if you don't have a screening, your diagnosis is not the same, and the prognostic of the disease is not the same. So in fact, when you go through conditional survival, you have the point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Busquet. We've had a couple of questions already in from the audience, so maybe we'll look at that. And we've got a question from Daniela, who says, what about people who are in total remission but still are on preventative hormonal treatment? So in her case, she's been on this for 10 years. They're still categorized as cancer patients, even though they don't have active care anymore. And she said, look, recently she was refused insurance because her radical treatment stopped more than 5 years ago, but she's still considered a patient. Dr. Meunier, perhaps you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you. In fact, in the member states who have the law, there are provisions with exception. And indeed, hormonal treatment is not considered as still active treatment. So if the country has established 5 years delay, you can have your hormonal therapy longer. It doesn't take into account in the country where we have the law. And that's why I think it's important to underline the grades of exception for hormonal treatment, but also for cancer who have much better prognosis, who don't need to wait for 5 years, like thyroid cancer, some testis cancer, some melanoma. In Belgium, breast in situ is no delay at all. So we have to take into consideration this grade of exception. And that's why I think it's important to have an harmonized European legal framework on that issue to avoid these inequalities.
Thank you. And I think you've also raised quite an interesting point, which is medical science is progressing. And we know, because we heard yesterday, there's some quite radical new things coming through in treatment that offer real significant cures. So the guidelines that you've talked about saying, well, for these cancers, there's certain exceptions. We need to, if something like this is put into law, we also need to a way of updating it regularly as we make medical progress, so that, as you say, if it's less than 5 years because we've made new progress, that we have some way of not only acknowledging the cancer survivors, you know, have similar risk patterns to the whole population, but also adding new people to that category as we address those cancers. Would you like to comment on that?
No, I think you told it very clearly. for each different issue, there are specific solutions. And indeed, there is an adaptation on a yearly or 2 yearly basis about what are those exceptions, taking into account the current progress in different type of disease.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've got a couple of other questions coming in from the audience. I've got a question from Roxana, and she's saying it's estimated that more and more cancer will be detected in younger populations as we get better at screening. And she's sort of saying for her, the younger population is 20, 30, 40. And she says, okay, what according to each of you should be the top priority of the European institutions to prepare to minimize the burden on society and the population? I'm not quite sure what burden she's talking about. Maybe it's financial burden or the care burden, but here's the question. We've got so much focus, the European Beating Cancer Plan, on sort of getting better treatments, etc. Have we given enough thought to the fact that, hey, we've got a whole new cohort of people who at relatively young ages are cancer survivors? Their active treatment is over. What do we need to put in place for them? So all of you nodded to me when I asked you that question. Now, are you nodding because we haven't done enough thought, or because, yes, we have done some thought? So Anya, maybe I can start with you. Have we got ourselves ready? Have we faced up to the fact that there's good news and there's more and more survivors, but we need to plan for that?
I mean, it's it is fantastic news that we have more and more survivors and people with lived experience. But for that, obviously, the infrastructure, we need adaptation of an infrastructure for that, and that's across many levels of life, and that's starting from access to long-term follow-up. That's access to financial services, access to labor market, that's access to mental health support, there's access to reconstruction, and that to retain a person with lived experience as a whole person and not just only defined by a diagnosis, right? And for that, we need research. And for that, we need a bigger, broader view for that. And not just, right, this is just a cancer survivor, now go on with your life. Because unfortunately, this is not working like that. And for that, also, we need to educate people with lived experience of what to express how we need to really have a broader, we need to change our thinking into how cancer was perceived and the diagnosis into what it is, into survivorship and lived experience. And that involves really interdisciplinary dialogue here. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Meunier, can I invite you to reflect on this? Because when we asked people at the beginning, we polled the audience, we said, what things do cancer survivors need? The number one thing people said was a survivorship care plan, that there needs to be this long-term follow-up.
But I think it requires a new type of specialty. As I said, the oncologists currently treating patients who need current treatment have not the skills and the opportunity to dedicate their time to this specific new issue. And I believe we need more interdisciplinary new type of infrastructure that we mentioned, the long-term follow-up clinic, with new type of specialty, including a psychologist, perhaps human resource, financial service specialist, and so on, who can guide them, because I don't expect that it's the caring oncologist who took care of the disease who can handle all of those specific issues and problems which require specific solutions.
Thank you very much. And I think you mentioned something I think that's really important. We need new research. We need to, get this kind of long-term follow-up of these new cohorts, and this needs to be done perhaps at European level. We need to develop a new discipline, perhaps a new sort of medical speciality that is looking at that. So thank you for setting that out. We've got a couple of other questions I'd like us to reflect on, and Lydia's got a question that maybe Anya, you could answer, because she said, look, thank you very much for focusing on that key moment transition from being a child when you were a child going through treatment, the communication happens between the parents and the doctors, and that's where the decision making happens. And then suddenly at 18 or whenever it is, you have to, all of that gets passed on to you, and you may not have been prepared for that, etc. And how do you communicate with that, particularly around that sort of very harsh moment from you having no control and no input to suddenly, right, it's all up to you?
Right, thank you very much, Lydia, for asking that question. That is something we are actually with Fundacja Paniani as well, and in a broader setting as well across Europe, working on. Now, we are, look, if you're a child in cancer care, your parents are usually your voice. Now, to regain your voice, you need to be also part of it. And if a lot of young people are just, I'm sorry to say, like passengers in their cancer care. So when the transition comes, when the adult life hits, and I'm sorry for being so blunt, but that's how it is, and you need to all of a sudden manage your agendas yourself. You need to manage your treatment, your quality of life in terms of long-term follow-up. This also requires education, and that's where us NGOs are coming into place and helping to facilitate that. So this is also something that healthcare professionals need to change in the settings, in their language. So I think that's also education of healthcare professionals in a broader setting. That's also psychologists and psycho-oncologists who need to adapt the language. That's also what has been said by my colleague, Dr. Busquet and Dr. Meunier. We need to change the approach, and that's a crucial setting. So education, changing of the language, and that's also EDI, right? We're talking about equality, diversity, and inclusion in a broader setting, and also in how we speak about survivorship and understand and comprehend survivorship as such. And we need to start with educating young cancer survivors, but we also need to have an infrastructure that can facilitate that. And that's also the long-term follow-up clinic. So again, one will not work without another. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. We've got a question from Arika, which I think maybe Dr. Busquet, you could help us explore a little bit. You mentioned that we have at European level a brand new cancer inequalities registry, and Arika wants to know a little bit more about inequalities of survivorship, both within member states, but also across the EU. Can you give us a sense of how this inequalities registers works, and is there any visibility for inequalities over the longer term rather than just short-term treatment?
The registry collect information on many different things, and you can have information coming from screening program, meaning before the disease, or you want to detect earlier the disease, and about treatment and what happened after, and survival, and data like that. And we observe some differences between country, but these differences are also within a country, depending on your social level in a country, depending if you go through screening program or not, you will have some differences, depending also on your risk factors. We are talking about cancer, not for childhood, but for adults. You have alcohol and tobacco, which are two major risk factors, and your habit can change many things. So that registry collect informations between countries, and you can also information within countries. And this is why you have some inequities or some differences. The name of the registry is Inequalities, but in fact you point out differences between countries, and that's important because they impact your life.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very struck by listening to all of you that what we're talking about is both things like Dr. Meunier's work on legislation. We're also talking about a change in mindset. We're talking about a change in the infrastructure, in the way that we deal with things. Because if I look at this week, we focused in the beginning in prevention, then diagnosis and treatment, and all of those we were talking about access to care. We were talking about transitioning in to treatment, and today we're talking about transitioning out. and what's put in place for the people who need that, what's put in place to gather the data for the long-term follow-up. So it's the legislation that Dr. Meunier talked about, the hardcore, making sure the basic human rights are respected, but also making sure that we have a scientific discipline, a medical discipline, the interdisciplinary process that we recognize that's so important during acute treatment, where you would have social care provided, you have psychosocial support and others. We recognize all of that, the full holistic nature of a patient, but when the treatment's done, we wash our hands and move people out. So I think for me, the message of this webinar that we've had is the critical importance of that transition out, and that the care needs to continue, and we need legal safeguards in place to make sure that people don't suffer discrimination, that they don't spend their lives defined by their disease, but they can return to being a person with aspirations and hopes and needs and plans for their lives, for their families, for their work, etc. So thank you to Dr. Meunier, to Dr. Bousquet, and to Anya, to really helping us explore this final element in transition that we've talked about all of this week. And it's been a really fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. I'm going to end with 2 calls to action. The first is, it's very clear to me, and I hope it is to you after listening to this, that we need a fundamental recognition of the needs of survivors, and that there is a discipline and a space that needs to be addressed. That critical transition out of acute treatment phase needs attention, and it needs long-term follow-up, and that needs policy frameworks to put in place. And secondly, we've got a couple of really concrete things that the new EU mandate could work on, which is the transposition of the revised Consumer Credit Directive into national law. And at that point, we need to make sure that the critical importance of cancer survivors is taken into account, so they have access to financial products. So we don't have a question like we had from one of our people who said, look, I can't get insurance. So the Consumer Credit Directive is one where we need immediate action. And the second thing is we call on policymakers to advocate for the inclusion of the 5-year period in the right to be forgotten in the upcoming revision of the Mortgage Credit Directive. So those are 2 very specific pieces of legislation that contribute to this bigger change in mind shift, cultural shift and structural shift to support the rights of cancer patients and cancer survivors. So I want to say thank you very much to all of you and to our panelists for joining it. Tomorrow's session is going to be looking at how smoking cessation is a step towards a cancer-free environment. Thank you all, and see you again.